Good evening, everyone. My name is Josh Owen. I'm the Massimo and Lela Vignelli Distinguished Professor of Design and the Director of the Vignelli Center for Design Studies. I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Vignelli Design Conversations lecture series presented by Design Milk and made possible in part by the generosity of RIT alumnus Chris Bailey and Bailey Brand Consulting, with additional support for today's lecture from RIT's School of Design and School of Individualized Study. Rochester Institute of Technology's Vignelli Center for Design Studies is an international hub for education, research, collaboration, and advocacy, which expands the scope of the programs in the College of Art and Design School of Design. The facility houses the archive of renowned designers Lela and Massimo Vignelli, whose works are icons of international design. The center and archive sit within RIT's College of Art and Design, which was built on the traditional territory of the Onondaga, or people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as Seneca people, keepers of the Western Door. They are one of the 6 sovereign nations that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We honor the land on which RIT was built and recognize the unique relationship the indigenous stewards have with this land. That relationship is the core of their traditions, cultures, and histories. We recognize the history of genocide, colonization, and assimilation of indigenous people that took place on this land. Mindful of these histories, we work towards understanding, acknowledging, and reconciling. As stewards of history and content, we must acknowledge and seek to learn from our context, bad and good, ugly and beautiful. This applies to the Vignelli Center, as with any archive. Today marks the 10-year anniversary of the opening celebration of the Vignelli Center for Design Studies. In addition to launching our new lecture series partnership with Design Milk today, we also are launching digital access to the archives through a partnership with Google Arts and Culture. Thanks to the work of our wonderful archivist, Jennifer Whitlock, now you can search and browse the archives virtually. Check out our social media for more exciting information about that. The Vignellis taught us that design is a systematic framework for solving the world's most intractable problems. If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that while we as humans are adaptable, our societies and systems have major flaws. We're at a point when we need to have difficult discussions and work to create a new balance in the world. In this, design must play a critical role. As the new director, I aim to make the Vignelli Center even more accessible and applicable by bringing in exciting guest contributors from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds who are using design in innovative ways. The Vignelli's "Design is One" philosophy leaves us with a universal message that design is a lens through which we can envision a more inclusive tomorrow. Before introducing our first esteemed guest of this year's lecture series, I'd like to take a few moments to set the stage. Out of respect for our presenter, participants will be muted for the duration of the event, but we do encourage you to enter questions you have for Natalie in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible during our closing Q&A. Thank you to our 2 captionists, Angela Bolger and Jody Luce, for joining us and providing their services this evening. To access, you can click on the closed caption along the bottom. To begin, I'd like to share with you how honored I am to welcome my friend and colleague for many years living and working in Philadelphia, Natalie Nixon. Before becoming director of the Vignelli Center, I worked to bring Natalie to RIT as a speaker for last year's lecture series. Unfortunately, her talk was scheduled for last March and due to the COVID outbreak had to be canceled. Call it a silver lining or simply circumstance, but I'm so happy to have her as the lead speaker in this year's series. Natalie Nixon, PhD, changes lives through ideas. She is a creativity strategist who happily integrates wonder and rigor into her life and her work. She converted a 16-year career as a professor into a successful consulting practice. At Figure 8 Thinking, she advises leaders on achieving transformative business results and accelerating value by applying creativity and foresight. Clients have included Comcast, Bloomberg, Citrix, Living Cities, and a host of others. Natalie incorporates her background in anthropology, fashion, as well as her experiences living around the world in places like Brazil, Israel, Germany, Sri Lanka, and Portugal to help her clients become more dynamic versions of themselves. She's the author of The Creativity Leap, Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work, and the editor of Strategic Design Thinking, Innovation in Products, Services, Experiences, and Beyond, and a regular contributor to Inc. magazine on creativity, design thinking, and the future of work. Natalie's board experience includes trustee of Vassar College, the Philadelphia Art Commission, Leadership in Design, and the Arts and Business Council of Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce. Natalie earned a BA in Anthropology and Africana Studies from Vassar College and an MS in Global Textile Marketing from Jefferson University and a PhD in Design Management from the University of Westminster in London. She is also certified as a foresight practitioner by the Institute for the Future and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Natalie lives in Philadelphia with her husband, John Nixon. Please join me in a big virtual welcome for Natalie.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you so much for that awesome introduction. It's just, I'm really happy that at this moment in time, I can look back on someone like you as having built a professional and personal relationship with through our work together at Philadelphia University. And it's just awesome that our paths continue to intersect. So I want to thank you for inviting me to contribute to this lecture series. I thank the Vignelli Center, RIT, Chris Bailey, and Design Milk. I think it just says so much how many diverse sponsors and contributors you have as part of this series. So good evening, everyone. Really happy to be here. I have prepared some ideas for us tonight. And as Josh mentioned, we'll have time at the end, probably about 15 minutes to hopefully really engage in my answering any questions that occur to you. There are going to be a couple of moments during my presentation when I'm going to pose a question, not a hard test question, just a couple of questions. And I'd love it if you responded, just jotted down some of your ideas, your responses to my questions in the chat area. And we will do our best to reflect back on those later. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, so I decided to call, capture as a title, my remarks for tonight, Level Up, Creativity and Context at Every Turn. And I chose that term level up in part because I'm a big pop culture fan. To this day, I still dance hip hop and I love Ciara. So I really like that song. And I like what it implies. And I think the implications about standing taller, broader, reaching beyond what we can maybe possibly see is really apropos for this time. And when Josh invited me to share some ideas as part of this lecture series, I have found it really important to integrate some of what's been top of mind for me about these times and what you all, as students of design, as practitioners of design or strategy or whatever it is that you do, to contextualize it. So here it goes. In a lot of ways, what I want to share is kind of a story about a spray can. And what I mean by that is many years ago, I was invited to become a board member of a really cool experiment. It was called CHAD. It stood for the Charter High School for Architecture and Design here in Philly. And CHAD started truly as an experiment by the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, or architecture. I'm probably butchering what that acronym stands for, but it's the Association for Professional Registered Architects. And they are accustomed to leave a legacy project wherever they convene to have their conferences that happen every few years. And they decided quite audaciously, after they convened in Philly, they said, let's start a school. Let's start a school around design and architecture. And it was audacious because they had no idea what they were doing in terms of the business of education and what it really takes to craft learning in a formalized way. But they launched this charter school. I became a board member probably around 5 years into the founding of the school, and I served for 3 years. And during one of those springs, the head of development for the school, she was very good at making connections with all sorts of designers in industry. And I should just say, just for context, a little bit about Philly. If you don't know much about Philadelphia, I'm from Philly and born and raised. I've lived in a lot of different places, as Josh has already indicated. Philly people, we either never leave or if we leave, we don't come back. And then there's a critical mass of us, like myself, who leave and come back. And Philadelphia has a very unfortunate, we are unfortunately the largest poor city in America. We fluctuate between being the 5th and 6th largest city in the United States. We have an incredibly high literacy rate. And we also happen to be, depending on the year, something between 50 to 65% African American. I don't know if that ethnic breakdown is causal or correlative to those really tragic statistics in terms of literacy and poverty, but those are some of the facts. And part of the goal of founding CHAD was to make sure that Black kids would be exposed to the design fields. Something like less than 0.05% of all registered architects in the United States of America are Black women, just as an example, right? So there is a real challenge in terms of ethnic diversity in the design field. And so it was really awesome that the AIA started this school to really try to shift that narrative. Anyway, it's about 6 or 7 years into the founding of the school. I'm serving on the board, and the head of development, who was really good at forging relationships with industry, figured out a way to invite a design group from Martha Stewart Design into the school. And they were package designers. And only a select group of students were invited to attend this conversation with this group of package designers from Martha Stewart Design. One of those young people was a 17-year-old African-American teenage boy. And these designers were going on and on about their design process. They were showing some of their portfolio. They had brought in some examples and samples. And at one point, they hold up a can of insect repellent. It was roach spray. And they're going on and on about how they came to deliver that particular color story and the design details. And this one young man, he raises his hand and he interrupts them politely. And he said, I don't think that's good design. And they were like, okay, but we're Martha Stewart Design. We have this pedigree. We've been trained in all these amazing places. Why do you say that? And the teenage boy said, well, it's too pretty. My sister is illiterate and she would think it was a can of air freshener. And their mouths dropped, their jaws just dropped, and they were gobsmacked because they realized in that moment that that was a perspective that they would have never considered. And I've always remembered that story because for me, it points out how important it is to do this phrase I like to say a lot, which is that the more diverse the inputs, the more innovative the outputs. I cannot possibly think of the sorts of questions that Josh would pose around a particular design challenge, or that you might pose, and vice versa. And when we have kind of similarly thinking people, or people with very kind of similar backgrounds, we will tend to keep asking the same questions. And when we do that, number one, it just ends up being poor design. And secondly, it's unintelligent business. And I'm not even touching on kind of the moral imperative to have a much more inclusive conversation as we design. So I want to start that story because in a lot of ways, what I really want to talk about is the story about a spray can. This is an image of the house that Sarah built. And I'm saying that facetiously. This is an image of the Winchester House in San Jose, California. It was designed by Sarah Winchester, who was the widow of a firearms magnate. Her husband, William Wirt Winchester, made his millions, hundreds of millions of dollars through the sales of arms. Now, the reason I'm starting with this image is because for those of you who may or may not know about this architectural feat of curiosities, this house is full of doorways that lead to nowhere, doorways that open onto walls, stairways that lead to nowhere, that just kind of have these dead ends. And it's an example of design done without any kind of thought about context or intention or end user. Right, so I'm just putting up the Winchester House as an example of when design goes really left, when it kind of becomes our worst nightmare. And speaking of nightmares, the house is thought to be haunted by the souls of people killed by the firearms by Mr. Winchester. That's the lore. On the other hand, you have a house like Falling Water, which is located in southwestern Pennsylvania, about 6 hours from where I live in Philly. It's just south of Pittsburgh. And this house, of course, was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and he designed it for a wealthy Pittsburgh retailer family, the Kaufman family. And I contrast the Winchester House with Falling Water because every single moment, use of material, perspective, angle, passageway is designed with intention to the environment, to context, to how people will use the space, how they will live. And so this is an example of intentional design. So I just wanted to use those two examples of the Winchester House on the one hand and Falling Water on the other, just to kind of just be as raising symbols of how intentional we might be in our design, no matter what sort of design practitioner you are, to kind of follow the warning call of that CHAD student, but also the skill and emotional intelligence of someone like Frank Lloyd Wright. I also love to always reference the story of how the OXO Good Grips products came to be. As a lot of you are probably aware, these OXO Good Grips, those really spongy handle kitchen utensil products, came about because Sam Farber was really trying to design an alternative for his wife, Betsy Farber, who struggled horribly with arthritic hands. And so he took his design idea to Smart Design, and they ended up rolling out the whole Good Grips collection. And of course, this is also a great example of intentional design that tends to fall into this category of universal design. Now, I first learned about universal design when I was a professor of fashion management. I had signed up to go to a conference in New York City. In part, I just wanted to get to New York, and I had some monies available to spend on a conference for my edification. I never heard of universal design. Universal design is about designing for the least amongst us, for designing specifically for people who are differently abled. And so the OXO Smart Grips kitchen product design really falls into this category of universal design because, as many of you are aware, it turns out that when we design for the least amongst us, for people who have trouble gripping a kitchen tool, it actually ends up being much better design for all of us. And since really understanding universal design, I really have always liked to extend this concept of designing for the least amongst us in all sorts of design, for service design, for experience design, for architecture. Again, to the point, the perspective that that young man at Chat so many years ago was pointing out, that if we factor in the questions, concerns, and realities for those who are often overlooked, in the case his sister, who had to hack her way through this world because she was not literate, and had to figure out all sorts of ways to pass, we would actually design much better solutions. And then, you know, these are times that are certainly calling for us to design better solutions when we think about what's been happening with Adidas. So I don't know how many of you came across the New York Times report about a very young woman, Julia Bond, that's Julia in the yellow jacket on the right-hand frame, who just really recently, maybe a year or two, graduated from college, got her dream job at Adidas as a young assistant apparel designer, and is in a, you know, she's getting acknowledged for her ideas. She's kind of feeling like she's getting part of the flow, and she's one of, you know, only a handful of Black designers in the building, or even Black people in the building that she knows, but she's, you know, she's making her way through. And what the New York Times report points out is that at a certain point, one of her colleagues points out, did you see the flag on the mood board? And she's like, no, what are you talking about? And they're like, it's a Confederate flag. And she's like, wait, a Confederate flag? No, that can't be. And she Googles an image of the Confederate flag, and she shows her colleague the image. She says, are you sure that's the flag you see? They were like, yeah, come on, let's go see. They go to the inspiration wall, and sure enough, part of the inspiration for an upcoming collection was an image of a Confederate flag. Now, if you know anything about American history, then you are well aware that the Confederate flag is a symbol of violence and atrocity and terrorism for Black Americans. It's not a symbol of inspiration for a design feature on you know, sportswear clothing. And that began her decision to act out her form of social justice, social protest. And the reason I'm bringing up this example is because A, it's very current. B, a lot of you who are tuning in are students of design. And I just want to stress, and I know Josh stresses this certainly in his classes, but it cannot be stressed enough, if this has just happened in 2020, this is, you know, post George Floyd's murder, we must recognize that design has context. Design has cultural context. Design is ultimately related to and connected to people. And it's a really interesting story. I really encourage you to look up the article. I can share the link with John, and he can you know, share it out later. If you listen to the daily podcast, that also captures it really well. And she, you know, she really put her neck out on the line. That's a whole nother conversation. But the fact that we in 2020 have a group of trained, storied, respected designers who never caught that, right? It was left to a, you know, somewhat strategically vulnerable junior level designer who happens to be African American, with not a lot of political, social capital in that organization, to call this out. And so I wanted to make sure I mentioned this story because it's so important for young designers to remember that you are never designing in isolation. And she even points out that the icons of Adidas are often Black American athletes, mega stars who are the source of hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue on the one hand, and yet something like a Confederate flag was used as the source of inspiration. So I often joke with my clients, because I do a lot of my work ends up being in this category of change management and organizational design, that I need to start making a t-shirt that says, "It's culture, silly." And I need to stop saying, I need to just design and make the t-shirt. But it really is culture, silly. We often underestimate how many of our challenges, how the root of so many of our conundrums could be navigated much more easily if we just start with acknowledging the role of the cultural context of everything. And this is an image from a Harvard Business Review interview with David Kessler that came out in March 2020. It's a really amazing interview, very short read. I read it because I was really captured by the title, which was that discomfort you're feeling is called grief. And David Kessler is known as one of the world's most renowned thought leaders and experts on grief. And there are two takeaways I had that are all related to what I want to hone in on tonight. One is that we typically think of grief in terms of 5 stages, and those 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and acceptance. And the first takeaway that David Kessler set straight is that actually, if you've been thinking of them as this linear process, no. They are completely nonlinear. So since the onset of COVID, if you have been feeling a bit of sadness and then you feel angry and then you finally accept, completely normal. Or if you're in denial and then you move straight to acceptance the next day, completely normal, right? So if you're feeling that kind of ping pong effect, you are just fine. The second takeaway that I got from the interview with David Kessler is that there actually should be a 6th stage of grief that we add into this time. Instead of ending on the stage of acceptance, David Kessler says the 6th stage of grief is meaning. MEANING, meaning. And for me, as a creativity strategist, the reason why I got so excited about that insight is that creativity is all about the business of meaning making. And so is design, right? Design is about the business of meaning making. So now more than ever during this time of the pandemic of COVID-19, we're going through really what I call a triple pandemic that involves COVID-19, systemic racism and the social justice protests around systemic racism, and unsustainability of the earth. We must be equipped to navigate this complexity with something like creativity, which fuels the work of design. So all of this has been context and a setup to a question that I have been wondering a lot about, which is what's the future of design? If we continue to pump out designers who don't catch a Confederate flag on a mood board, if we have an African-American teenager who can call out to a group of storied, educated designers at a really established brand that a particular product is actually not good design, if the percentage of product designers, architects, fashion designers, graphic designers, etc., if the percentage of ethnic minority representation, ethnic minority from the USA perspective remains abysmally low, what's the future of design? because the reason why that question is so important is that designers get to shape the way we navigate this world. Designers get to shape, the clothes we wear and the status it gives us and the confidence or esteem that it helps us to feel, the self-expression that we're allowed through something like fashion design. Designers get to ensure that our shelter is not only functioning, but it's beautiful. They get to ensure that the everyday products that we use are so well designed that they become kind of discreet. We barely realize that they're there. They're functioning so well. The form and function just merges so well. But if we don't have a much more contextualized, intentional way of designing, I foresee that design could become negligible in the future. It could just become something that is this artifact of the past if we don't quickly pivot and ensure that we are at every turn are factoring in culture, context, and making sure it's fueled by creativity. And I of course, want to have a lot to say about creativity. So in other words, we have to figure out our new true north as it relates to design. We're living in a world where it's increasingly dangerous to insist on silos of creative types. Sure, there are artists, yes, there are designers, but unless everyone is encouraged to exercise their creative capacity, then we are doomed. And I wanted to make sure I typed out this slide because I come from a perspective that we need to shy away from talking about the creatives or creative types. Yes, there are artists. Yes, there are designers, but to be human is to be hardwired to be creative. And right now, during this time of a triple pandemic, it is essential that we encourage everybody to exercise their creativity. A creativity leap is required for what we're calling this fourth industrial revolution today. So you've heard about the first industrial revolution, which was all about steam, and then the next industrial revolution, which was about introduction of electronics and more automation. Third industrial revolution was about mass customization. This fourth industrial revolution, the train has left the station, it's happening right now, is a revolution where technology is ubiquitous. If you Google everything to find answers, that's artificial intelligence. It's highly likely that 50% of surgeries in hospitals now are being conducted by robots. That's ubiquitous technology. If you use an Alexa app, I have one on my desk. I should not have said that so loudly because it just started to blink, but that's a combination of virtual reality augmented reality and artificial intelligence. In past industrial revolutions, the human being has had to merge and morph into the technology. The opportunity today is that the technology will amplify what it means to be uniquely human. In other words, to amplify creativity. And I just want to share a few signals on the landscape that have been demonstrating to me that creativity is absolutely an essential competency that we've got to exercise. The first signal I'll share comes from the World Economic Forum. Back in 2015, 5 years ago, the World Economic Forum identified creativity as the number 10 job skill by 2020. 1 year later, in 2016, they said, actually, we now think that creativity is going to rank as the number 3 job skill. And what's really interesting to me is that job skills numbers 1 and 2 are problem solving and critical thinking. So PS, creativity is actually includes problem solving and critical thinking. So creativity is really ranking as the number 1 job skill for 2020 and beyond. I've already mentioned that I love popular culture. A couple other signals on the landscape I'll quickly mention that are pointing to how significant creativity is. The young man on the left of the screen, he's a character named Junior from the show Blackish. And in this scene, he is tiredly trying to explain to his parents why although he has been admitted into college, he has no intention of going right away. He wants to take a gap year, and they are completely through with him because they are a solidly Black bourgeoisie, middle-class American family, and that's what they've worked so hard for. And he's saying, no, I want to take a gap year. The young lady in the middle is the character Abigail in the hit series Big Little Lies. And she is similarly exasperatedly explaining to her mom, played by Reese Witherspoon, that she's not even going to apply to college. In fact, she's already gotten a job at a startup. Now, why are these signals on the landscape pointing to creativity? Because these, in my view, are indicators that young people really have this urgency to learn by doing. They're less and less interested on the sage on stage model, and they want to learn experientially, all things pointing to creativity. And finally, the woman on the right of the screen is the character Wendy Rhodes from the television show Billions. And Wendy is a psychologist at a really highly driven venture capital firm called Axe Capital. And what does Wendy do as in the C-suite? She's up there with the founder, the CTO, the CFO, the CIO. She's helping these men who wake up every day to make more and more hundreds of millions on the margin to identify their inner child, to practice deep breathing, meditation, visualization. So all of these are signals that are pointing to an embrace of the human quotient, all encaptured in creativity, because soft skills, it turns out, are really hardcore. They're not these wishy-washy elements that are just add-ons. They are essential. And they are essential because we have to survive in a VUCA environment, and an environment that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So I'm proposing that in this VUCA environment, we navigate and manage complexity with complexity, specifically creativity, because creativity, as it turns out, is this complex system. So here was a moment where I was going to ask you to think about, if you wanted to just type into the chat really quickly, how do you define creativity? Because you guessed it, I'm going to share in a moment how I think about creativity. I'd love for you to just jot down the ways that you think about creativity right in the chat. And I'm going to continue. Sometimes when people think about creativity, they think about someone with musical ability. Other times they think about someone who can while away the afternoon painting, and then we have this kind of very idyllic view of what it means to be a visual artist. Perhaps they think about people who are gifted in dance and can tell stories through movement with incredible technique. I've given a lot of thought to that, and I wrote a book recently about this called The Creativity Leap. And I really was trying very hard to listen to a range of people and offer up hopefully a simple and accessible definition of creativity. Because I really like this quote by the jazz bass player, Charlie Mingus. Charlie Mingus said that making the simple complicated is commonplace, but making the complicated simple, awesomely simple, that's creativity. So here goes my efforts to offer up a simple definition of creativity. I think of creativity as our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems. It's our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems and create novel value. That's creativity. And if we think about creativity in that way, we realize that an attorney like Nicole Pittman is super creative in the way that she improvises solutions in her policymaking around sex offense policy. The Mainoffs here are fruit farmers, where they do an incredible amount of improvisation and experimentation because you talk about a VUCA environment. Every day they wake up to Mother Nature, the earth, to figure out how to offer a better product. This is Céline Barrel, who is a nose. She's a perfumier at International Flavors and Fragrances. And I learned from her this amazing balance between intuition and chemistry. And I interviewed over 50 people who come from scientists at NASA, farmers, our family plumber is actually the gentleman in the black and white photo, educators, technologists, etc., to see if this idea of toggling between wonder and rigor resonated with them. Because creativity is this productivity play, and it's a competency. And certainly, if you are a student of design, if you are a designer, you are well aware of this. Now, I'm going to nerd out for a moment and just explain what I meant when I said that we have to navigate complexity with complexity. And then I said creativity is a complex system. Here's what I meant by that. Creativity is a chaotic system. A K-word is a word that Dee Hock, the founder of the first president of Visa credit card, made up. And he observed that in nature, there is this amazing interplay between chaos and order. And chaos is not anarchy, it's randomness. Order is not control, it's structure. And you find chaotic systems in nature. That's how forests bloom up over hundreds and hundreds of years. You find chaotic systems as interplay between randomness and order, chaos and structure, and the ways that our bodies heal. You find chaotic systems in jazz music. Jazz is a chaotic system, right? And you definitely see the influence on me in the way I'm defining creativity. That creativity is this toggling between wonder and rigor. The wonder is the chaos part. The rigor is the order part. And here's what's really interesting. When sometimes people ask me, where should we start? Should we start first with the wonder or should we start with the rigor? And the answer is start, because wonder is found in the midst of rigor. And simultaneously, rigor cannot be sustained without wonder. We will burn out if we are churning, and do not make time and space for wonder. So let me unpack what I mean by each of these. Wonder is about dreaming, imagining, pretending, curiosity, awe, and pausing. And I was really buoyed by the fact that really incredible thought leaders like Socrates and Abraham Heschel paid attention to wonder. Socrates is known for having said that wisdom begins in wonder. And the civil rights activist, Jewish civil rights activist and theologian Abraham Heschel wrote that it's wonder rather than doubt that's the root of all knowledge. So that's how important wonder is. So something to think about. Who for you, living or dead, is a wonder mentor? And I really encourage you to have someone or a group of people in mind, because they will serve as your lighthouse. When you get stuck in the rigor of work, you've got to pause and also design rituals for wonder. So for me, I'll share, children are a sustaining model of wonder for me, because of the way of how audacious they are, the way they find awe in really simple things. Rigor is about practice, time on task, discipline, being super thorough. And the great Leonardo da Vinci, the original Renaissance man, is known for having said that any obstacle can be destroyed through rigor. So it's really important that we understand that creativity, if we think about creativity as toggling between wonder and rigor, it's not only the domain of artists. It's kind of unfair when we ghettoize creativity as only being something that artists are good at or designers are good at. Number one, it's not fair to artists or designers. And number two, it's not beneficial to our society at large. What I've learned is that the best scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs are incredibly creative, according to the way I'm thinking about defining creativity. So similarly, I want you to think about who for you, living or dead, is a Rigor mentor. And for me, the great American dancer choreographer Twyla Tharp is one of my Rigor mentors because of her fastidious discipline and her adherence to practice stretching her body every single morning. So I want to conclude just by leaving you with 3 tactics that you can start to practice to exercise your creativity. I call it my 3I creativity model. It's to inquire more, to improvise, and to intuit. And inquiry is about being curious and asking different questions. Improvisation is not about being able to play a really great jazz solo. Improvisation is all about being adaptive, being about the build, experimental, and intuition is about listening to that inner antenna to make decisions. Intuition is pattern recognition. So 3 things you can start doing to practice the 3 I's. Number 1, you can insist on creative abrasion teams. Creative abrasion is a term that the designer Jerry Hirschberg, who used to be the head of design at Nissan International, would insist on. He would insist that people from sales and finance and manufacturing were part of the problem solving because he understood that the end result of friction and abrasion is energy. So why not convert that energy that comes from friction and abrasion into something positive? To become better at improvising, become a clumsy student of something, away from your major, away from your daily work. For me right now, I am a clumsy student of the tango and the foxtrot forms of dance. And it's awesome because it helps me develop a sense of humor about myself. It helps me to become super adaptive and experimental. It also helps me to practice curiosity and intuition. And finally, to get better at intuiting, document the last 3 times you followed the nudge, that you listened to your heart. What was the result? And similarly, journal about or document the last 3 times that you ignored the nudge and what was the result. So to really, really conclude, I have been, in the midst of this triple pandemic, been talking to my clients about, been writing about these 4 creativity leaps that we've got to make. We have to make a leap away from only focusing on what's rational to becoming ambiguous confident. We have to make a leap away from only being fixated on our tribes, which, tribes are important. They forge connection, but the only way we build community is to extend beyond our tribes. Communities are made up of multiple tribes. We have to leap away from deep specialization to embracing becoming a polymath, like Leonardo da Vinci, who was a mathematician, an astronomer, an artist. And we have to make a leap away from only paying attention to the rule book to embracing the playbook. And the playbook allows us to have fluid structures, to know how to act in the moment according to the need at hand. If you would like to read a sample chapter of the Creativity Leap, you can text the word create to this number, 33777, or you can just go to figure8thinking.com and you can easily download a sample chapter, and definitely stay in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you. All of the young teenagers and young minds who have the audacity to question what we are considering to be good design deserve all of us to make these creativity leaps, deserve for all of us, especially in this time, during this triple pandemic, to pivot and to reach far beyond what our assumptions are, so that we are always considering context, we're always considering culture, and so that ultimately we can all become much better creatives. And that's what I have for tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was wonderful. And I want to sort of thank you on behalf of all those who are watching right now, because we missed the in-person hand claps and the support that comes from being buoyed by everyone's presence. But I can speak for everyone and saying that I think we're all feeling that. And I want to thank you for your intellect and your buoyancy and your incredible optimism in galvanizing these ideas in a way that makes them applicable and viable, I think, as learning tools. So thank you so much for sharing all that with us tonight. I'm getting a few questions that are coming via private chat to me, so I want to jump into them so that we can use some of this remaining time in that way. One that just came in says, do you believe the design community is becoming more aware and tackling those issues regarding systemic racism, COVID, and unsustainable living? And how can we keep the momentum of those discussions and dialogues to transform society for the better?
That's a great question.
That is the question, isn't it?
That is the question. And embedded in your question, you mentioned sustainability. I do see evidence of a lot of effort, a lot of energy where designers are dealing with, I've been calling it around the unsustainability. But, I don't believe the design community, I think the design community could do more in terms of identifying, for example, design solutions to systemic racism. All systemic challenges are opportunities to redesign. The system has to be redesigned, right? And part of the challenge is that in the United States, we've never dealt well with the sins of our past. And so it's like this sugar-coated sore, and it keeps erupting and popping up. And especially this summer, the world, the veil has been pulled back. So, designers are human. Designers are part of a cultural context themselves and have to work, and it behooves each designer to face their own issues. But here's why I especially think that creativity is the competency, is the mindset and the skill set that will help us navigate these challenges of this triple pandemic. It's because creativity thrives in mess. And these are really messy times. And because creativity thrives in mess, it also will allow for the grace that will need to be given when we have missteps, when we make mistakes, when we say the wrong thing, when we fumble. Complex challenges cannot be navigated with a linear Gantt chart. Complex challenges are best navigated with complexity, as I was saying earlier. So with, all that a creativity, mindset, and skill set through inquiry, improvisation, and intuition allow us.
I think you've spoken to this already, but I'm seeing another question that's related that you might want to speak to. What are effective strategies to challenge authority when bringing audacious ideas to the table?
I think inquiry. I think polite inquiry, thinking more with questions. I've been really influenced by the work of Warren Berger, who wrote an amazing book called A More Beautiful Question. There's a great website by the same name, A More Beautiful Question. And he reminds us that asking questions is a way of thinking. And we've become so conditioned to either responding to questions in kind of a punitive way or expecting a punitive response, or we think of questions as a challenge to our personhood rather than as a means to explore. And he really identified a wonderful structure that the most innovative companies seem to lead with. They start by asking why. Why do we only hire people from these sorts of schools? Why do we only hire people under age 40? Why have we never marketed to the Southern Hemisphere? Why? And then they shift to what if? What if we hired people who only have a high school diploma but incredible work experience? And then they converge into how might we do that, right? So curiosity, inquiry is I think a really, it's simple and challenging, but it really exercises our minds very different, and it becomes the beginning of real culture change in an organization.
I think that's a great answer. There are more coming in. I'm gonna, while I kind of weed through a couple more, I'm gonna ask you one of my own, which is, in my Philly days, I was also kind of pulled into the Charter High School of Art and Design to, offer some insights and to experience the really amazing kids that were coming up there. I'm curious, since you've been involved, more recently than I, there. Do you feel that they're making a difference? Do you feel that they're contributing to a change in sowing the seeds that they intended to sow?
So I know the story didn't end there. Sadly, the Charter High School for Architecture and Design, no longer exists because its charter was not renewed, and that's an example of kind of the casualties of, there's one, on the one hand, you have AIA had this vision and this concept, but had to work within these strictures of policy. And I'm oversimplifying all that went into the ultimate demise of the school, and I don't even know all the details, but the net is that this charter was not renewed, and so the school no longer exists. So that because of that, there are those many fewer young people of color who will even be exposed to fields like industrial design and architecture and user experience design and those sorts of things.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about that. But
Yes.
perhaps there's a silver lining in knowing that we have to do better, and that institutions like CHAD, we're off to a good start.
Yes.
Another question just came in. How do we ask questions when interacting with cultures where it is considered unacceptable or rude to ask questions?
That's a really good one. I just got finished reading a book called, I think it's called it's called Saving Face by Maya Hu Chan. And Maya is Chinese ethnically, and she talks about the book is really about cultural differences and how do you navigate and differences of the ugly American and being really upfront and blunt and I lived and worked in Sri Lanka, and I remember so many times my Americanness just reared itself up because my Sri Lankan colleagues would not always want to give me a direct answer. They wanted to save face. They wanted to figure out a way to problem solve backstage and then voila, have an answer. And I wanted to be able to kind of collaborate with them all along the way. So I think the first step is to really acknowledge the notion of culture. There's my t-shirt, it's culture, silly, right? to really acknowledge cultural differences. And a lot of her advice in this book is to be able to, before you walk into the meeting, into the room, do some thinking about that possibility and just have an aside conversation. It's kind of the meeting before the meeting after the meeting. There's again, that's all about context. That's all about appreciating all of the tacit and implied cascading effects of an action, of a remark that's made, of something that you didn't do that you didn't realize you were expected to do, and just making the time to kind of check ourselves rather than assume. And that comes through asking questions. And I'll give another example. Something I've started doing in my strategic advisory practice is I start out the relationships asking, what should I know about you working with you? Like, what are your pet peeves? And may I share mine? Because that saves weeks, months from so much like toxic buildup and annoyances. If you know that I hate getting so much email, just send me a text, right? Or I'd rather know sooner rather than later. Or um, you would prefer a telephone call and not waiting until I can see you face to face. I mean, whatever it is, right? So it's having that cultural understanding, and it's politely setting the stage for a conversation to ask those questions. That's one of those one of the techniques I've used.
I think that's a fabulous answer. Your toolkit seems unlimited and so applicable. And again, I very much appreciate your sharing that wisdom with all of us, and look forward to keeping a conversation going with you in the future. Thank you again for joining us tonight, Natalie. I think that was a great way to wrap it up. So
Thank you so
again,
much for having me, everybody. Thank you, Josh.
take care, Natalie. Thank you so much.
Bye.